Well, if the ACC were to implode, the Big 12 could benefit with teams that would become available. But are they prepared to actually make that sort of move?
You are Locked On College Football, your daily podcast on all things college football. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Locked On College Football. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view every day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This is your number one source to stay up to date with the biggest stories in the greatest sport on planet Earth. Realignment, the portal, the carousel, everything and more. We've always got you covered. Today's episode is brought to you by Nissan. Are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little further? Ever wonder what adventure could be around the next corner? Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Check them all out today at nissanusa.com. Drake Toll joining me here on today's show of Locked On Big 12. Let's just hop right into it, Drake. Let's say the ACC falls apart. Now, I talked on yesterday's show. I don't think that that's likely, even if Florida State were to leave, but lots of things that I don't think have been likely have come to pass before. We don't need to go into all of that and such, but if the ACC were to suddenly dissolve and you had all these teams sitting there, how prepared is the Big 12 to try and go scoop up teams like Pitt or Boston College or any of the other teams that would probably get left behind if big schools go to the Big 10 or the SEC?
Yeah, one of the first things to note here, Spencer, is we are trimming the fat of college football. That is some of the vernacular you're hearing out of the top names and the top talking heads. So a Boston College is not on the Big 12's radar. However, teams like Pitt, teams like Louisville are right there. And in the event the ACC implodes or only partially implodes, the Big 12 is going to go on the attack. Now, you've heard that NC State and Virginia Tech might be tied to North Carolina and Virginia. That's going to complicate things because I believe the SEC and the Big 10 see value in Virginia, see value in North Carolina because they create a chokehold on the East Coast, bring in big brands both educationally and athletically, and possibly bring in new TV markets. The only issue is little brother. They don't really like NC State. They don't really like Virginia Tech. And that puts the Big 12 in a position where if they could detach an NC State or Virginia Tech, they could land some middle-of-the-pack brands in the ACC and possibly survive off those. Now, you've also heard murmurs of a Clemson and a Miami. What are they going to do? They weren't very happy with the addition of Cal, Stanford, and SMU, and that's maybe the biggest catalyst to this. Florida State saying, look, we didn't make the college football playoff. We hate our grant of rights. We get a raw deal from a TV standpoint, and we hate these new guys. We want out. They are going to do whatever it takes, whether it's a settlement or actually winning in court, to go. Do I think that crushes the ACC? Not exactly. But if Clemson, who was already unhappy, or Miami want to go, then at that point, Brett Yormark is in a position to give them an offer, to try his very best. I do believe those are a couple of brands that are passed up to the SEC or the Big Ten if they want them. But Spencer, one thing I gotta hone in on here, a Clemson. 15 years ago, we weren't having this conversation about the Tigers. We didn't care where Clemson was. They were just a middling brand in college football that had been good in the 90s at one point. It's 15 years, 10 years of dominant winning that has created the brand that Clemson is. My case is, what if the next 5 years Clemson sucks? Dabo Swinney leaves and they're middle of the pack. Where does their brand fall? Florida State can be bad for the next decade and still have prowess. Clemson, on the other hand, maybe not. I think the SEC and the Big Ten realize that. If Kansas State wins 2 national championships and has a good 10-year run, they effectively become Clemson. So I don't know where a couple of these brands that are being so overvalued by the public will actually fall, and the Big 12 might have a better shot than we think.
I think when you talk about Clemson and saying, what if they suck with Dabo Swinney? What if it just completely implodes? Well, what does that mean? I mean, Clemson sucked last year. They went 9-4.
Yeah.
You know how many football programs in this country at the FCS, Group of 5, or Power 4 levels would look at 9-4 and give their coach an extension and say, yippee-ki-yay, this was outstanding? I think that's a relative term of what's bad for Clemson. Like they would have to, I think, string together 3 or 4 consecutive years of failing to win 10 games before you could say, all right, they're not the same. They're not exactly that top tier band. But right here, right now is when everything is happening. So I see your point about Clemson down the road. Well, maybe they don't look the same, but Florida State is trying to make this happen now. Florida State wants to get out of the ACC as soon as possible. Clemson's brand, I don't think, can take a significant enough hit in that short of amount of time to where they just wouldn't be appealing to pair with Florida State if you're the SEC or the Big Ten. I want to ask a logistical question about the Big 12, because when they added the former Pac-12 schools, the Four Corners, they were able to give them full media rights shares because of a clause in the Big 12's contract with ESPN and Fox. How many schools do you think that would apply to if ACC schools are suddenly available? Would they go for 2 more? Would they go for 4 more? Would they go for 6? How many do you think they would be able to give a sufficient amount of money to where it doesn't start diluting the pool for everybody else?
The magic number here is 20. I think the magic number for the Big 12 is going to be 20, which is adding 4 more schools. And it honestly depends on who those brands are. There's not going to be, hey, we'll bring in a full revenue share for Boston College or Syracuse. There's no way the Big 12, Brett Yormark, or the TV networks would buy into that. And the prime example is Washington State is a better brand, especially from a TV value standpoint, than Boston College and Syracuse. So if you're already passing up on Washington State and thus Oregon State, you're certainly not going to go after those 2 schools and a couple of the ACC. Look at a Wake Forest. Everybody's sitting around thinking, oh man, Wake Forest isn't bad, but boy, they sure don't move the needle. They sure don't push the dollar here. No. So I don't want them. The Big 12 doesn't want them. Now, if Louisville's there, if Pitt is there, then we start opening a conversation of we can give 4 teams a full revenue share if they're the right 4 teams. But if it falls that, hey, the ACC is going to backfill with Tulane and Memphis and USF, and here's how they're going to keep everything together, I think that's when you start talking about the Big 12 going, yeah, well, we're not going to stick our neck out for Wake Forest. We'd rather stay at 16 than bring in Boston College.
I saw that article the other day as well that you just kind of alluded to about, the Tulane or South Florida and Memphis, maybe Oregon State, Washington State getting picked up in the ACC if schools were to depart. I think the ACC would be in a rather precarious spot at that point, because if you're welcoming in those schools, how much revenue money are they going to need from their media rights deal, right? Because SMU is very unique. Cal and Stanford also kind of unique. Do those schools, is Memphis's athletic department able to take $0 in media rights the way SMU is? How much are you going to give them a share? How much do you bring them on for? How long before they can be a full member there? And then what's the state of your conference? And I want to get you out of here on this. If Florida State and Clemson, let's say they're the only schools to leave the ACC, and you're looking at a conference that is now headlined by Miami and North Carolina State and North Carolina, maybe Duke with Manny Diaz and what they can do in the transfer portal nowadays, bringing in guys like Malik Murphy from Texas. I think the playoff committee that is already looking at a 14 to 16 team playoff in 2026 would look at that conference and say, you get 1 automatic bid. Because I don't think that conference, even with Miami and NC State in there, I don't think that conference is on the same level as what the Big 12 would be. And obviously, it'd be way behind the Big 10 and the SEC. That's what I suspect they would do. Do you agree?
In essence, here, what you're creating is 3 tiers of college football, maybe even 4 if you want to talk about the group of conferences. You're looking at the SEC and the Big Ten. They're certainly the big dogs here. They still have dead weight. Northwestern still exists. Purdue still exists. And I know that any given year they can be good brands. They're just not. They don't fit the bill of a USC or an Oklahoma or an Alabama. Then at that second tier, there's the Big 12 sitting okay with a Utah to come in and anchor that conference. And then there's that weird level between the Big 12 and where the ACC would fall without Florida State and Clemson, where that conference just isn't valuable from a media rights standpoint. And by the way, they don't have a guaranteed media rights deal through the end of their grant of rights. It was just kind of something that Jim Phillips and company hoped would come together, and it hasn't yet. So what you'd create is 3 tiers at the top of college football. And thus, at that point, that's why I believe the ACC likely does implode. It can't stand on a leg without Clemson and without Clemson and Florida State before at some point backfilling's not enough.
It can't stand on a strong leg. It could stand on a leg. It might be there because there are a lot of schools who would suddenly be left to join the Pac-12 rebuild or join the American Conference or what have you and such. But we'll cross that bridge in its entirety when we come to it. Drake Toll, Locked On Big 12, Monday through Friday on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts, just like this show. Drake, thanks so much for stopping by.
Spencer, always a pleasure.
Michigan, how's it going in Ann Arbor? Because their team, it's going to look a lot different than it did a season ago. Before we get to Michigan, today's episode of Locked On College Football is brought to you by FanDuel. You can get buckets like your favorite NBA players with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. That's a pretty darn good ROI, or return on investment, if you will. Bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams, as well as anything you could possibly want in the college football world. You got quick bets for NBA games, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and more to spice up the NBA regular season. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot, whatever it may be. NBA, college football, they've got everything that you want at FanDuel.com/lockedon. Shoot your shot. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. Michigan's win total to me feels way too high. 9.5 for the defending national champs that sent 18 guys to the combine, new coach, new quarterback, new defensive coordinator. Let's talk about it with Craig Shemon, Locked On Big Ten, joining me here on today's show. And Craig, am I nuts for just not understanding why Michigan is still being regarded in such high fashion in the betting community?
Well, that's great. I love the betting community. So when those win totals came out, I started talking about that. I did it on Locked On Big Ten, and Michigan fans got after me a little bit because I dared to suggest that they would take a step backward in 2024. However, I kind of softened it. I said, look, if they lose one game, that's a step backward. Okay. They were undefeated national champions last year. So whether it's 1 loss, 2 loss, 3 loss, they will take a step backward a little bit, but I think they'll still be competitive. I was talking to a former All-American offensive lineman from yesteryear, from the Bo years, and he said, look, man, the next round coming up, the guys that have been waiting, just as talented, just as good. I don't know if they're that talented, but they're going to be a pretty talented football team to where I think they will be competitive. But if they lose 2 or 3 games, I don't think it's the end of the world in a transition year at Michigan.
I don't think so either. I don't think it spells disaster for the program or would be a major indictment of Sherrone Moore. I think if Michigan goes 8-4, 9-3, and goes under their win total, I think that would be a successful first year, because no one, myself included, and I think everybody else, is expecting them to go undefeated, as you said. And let's accept the premise for a moment that the offensive line will be just as good as it was last year. I don't think you can do that in a transition year like this. It can still be good. I think there's a high floor with what you've got on this Michigan roster because of the way they've recruited the last couple of years, but they sent a record 18 players to the NFL Combine, Craig. And when you have not been supremely active in the transfer portal, you can't field a roster that is as good as what you had the year prior when it was at that sort of level. I think the drop-off is going to be rather sizable. And look, does that mean they're, a 4 or 5 win team? No, I don't think so, especially with the non-conference schedule that they have, but they do have Texas in there. However, their schedule, generally speaking, is not insanely brutal. I just look at Texas, I look at Oregon, I look at Ohio State, and I think Michigan's going to be at a roster deficit in all 3 of those games.
Well, they might be. I think the comparison here to watch as the season goes on is let's watch Washington and let's watch Michigan. They both lost a boatload of people. They both have new coaches. We'll see how they do. Now, my vibe right now is that I think Michigan will be competitive. I don't know what to expect out of Washington. They may have to kind of start over a little bit. Maybe you feel differently. But those are going to be 2 case studies to go head-to-head. And you're right. Michigan did not hit the transfer portal hard. They also did not lose a bunch of guys the way when Nick Saban retired at Alabama and everybody left. That did not happen at Michigan. They only lost 1 or 2 guys. So the feeling is, a lot of the guys that are stepping up are still experienced guys. They've just been waiting their turn a little bit. So I don't think this is your typical cupboard is empty, losing 18 guys going to the combine and going to the NFL. That would be devastating for almost every team in college football. But I do think there's some talent coming in, and it's like you look at their offensive line. I think there's going to be 1 sophomore. Everybody else can be a junior or a graduate senior. And that's what they did last year. Anytime anybody got hurt or was out for a game or two. They were replacing seniors with seniors. It is ridiculous how deep they are. And I think that will help them here in the transition period. I think the key year to watch will be next year, 2025. Sherrone Moore to be a year plus removed from Jim Harbaugh. Those will really be the younger guys. But from what I'm hearing, I think they're mildly optimistic that they're not going to win the Big Ten. They're not going to win. This is all about Ryan Day at Ohio State. Can he do it? Can Oregon come in and win in its first year? That's the storyline. And by the way, it's great those two teams play each other. But I don't think they're going to fall off. I don't think the bottom of the world's going to fall out from underneath them.
I think that depends on what your definition of fallout is. I don't expect Michigan to be a playoff team in 2024. I think if they did that, Sherrone Moore should get an extension and a raise. And I don't think that he should be harshly judged in this first year because of the amount of transition that he's dealing with. You mentioned Washington, and I think the Huskies are in a similar spot. Now, Vegas thinks that Michigan is going to be better. Their win total is a full 2 games above the Huskies there. The recruiting classes that are on the roster holding over from the Kalen DeBoer era are not as highly ranked, at least in the composite world and 24/7 sports and such, as what you've got at Michigan. So I think that's slight advantage to the Wolverines. Here's where I give the advantage to Washington in that side-by-side comparison. I've got a guy who has been a head coach for an entire season and also been the play caller. Now, Sherrone Moore has done, some spot work for Michigan, did very well this past season, of course, beat Ohio State. It's not as if he's incompetent on game days, but I think it's different when you're filling in as the interim compared to when you have been the head coach. So I give Jedd Fisch the nod right there at this point in time. And then secondly, I've got Will Rogers, who has thrown hundreds upon hundreds and hundreds of passes in college football in his career. And on the other side, you got Alex Orji at quarterback, who's been a wildcat guy the last couple seasons. I know he can move, but I don't know that much else. That's where I give the advantage to the Huskies.
Well, and that's a great point on the quarterback because as I sat here and told you for the first 3 minutes that, hey, they got guys stepping up in all the positions. Let's not forget the most important position on the field. And you're right. I don't know what Alex Orji is either. And look, he would come in for 3 plays, run a couple. And I don't know that he can throw downfield, although Michigan doesn't run a lot. But, I mean, come on, you got to be able to throw. I mean, they don't throw a lot. That's the problem with J.J. McCarthy right now. And coming off the combine, nobody's seen him throw. So
did he threw at the combine, right?
Yeah, he threw. I
think that's smart.
Stats, there's not a huge body of work. Like a typical game for J.J. McCarthy, the second half of the season was 12 pass completions for 140 yards and 1 touchdown, and they go win by 30 points. So everybody was all critical. He didn't have the body of work. He did throw at the combine a little bit, but Orji, he doesn't throw either. So I'm as curious as anybody to watch him in the spring game and see how he does in Ann Arbor with that, and then the couple other guys behind him. Because like you said, they didn't go and really get anybody in the portal, and they do have to get that figured out. That is a big question mark for Michigan.
Yeah, it is. And last thing that I'll get you out of here on, Craig, is the Jim Harbaugh move, of course, makes plenty of headlines, and Sherrone Moore is the head coach, but perhaps, I don't know if I would say unsung hero, but one of the key pieces of that national championship team was Jesse Minter, the defensive coordinator. That Washington offense was legit. That's the best passing offense in college football since 2019 LSU with Joe Burrow and 3 NFL receivers. You got a first-round quarterback in Michael Penix with 3 receivers. Michigan didn't just shut them down with personnel. They did so with scheme. They did not have the sorts of openings that they were accustomed to. Penix was under duress. He wasn't fully comfortable, never settled into the game. How big of a loss is that, in your view, losing Jesse Minter as the defensive coordinator, and what do you make of who they've brought in?
First of all, it's a huge loss. I agree with you. I thought it was absolutely brilliant trying to scheme Alabama and Washington in the postseason last year, and that is a big loss. Now they get Wink Martindale, who's he knows his way around a defense. It's going to be different, and he's a little older coach too. He's going to come in there and run things his way. They got some talent there with Kenneth Grant and Mason Graham, guys on the defensive line that kind of stuffed the old defensive line. They got those guys coming back. Rod Moore comes back with the game-winning interception against Ohio State. So there is some talent there. but I think they got a good defensive coordinator, but I think really highly of Jesse Minter. And I think almost anybody that they would bring in might be a step down at coordinator on defense. So you bring up a good point.
Yeah, Wink Martindale, get ready, Michigan fans. On third down, I'm going to spoil this for you. He's going to blitz. And when he's done blitzing, he's going to blitz a little bit more and make you try to figure it out. Craig Shemon, Locked On Big Ten. Thanks so much for stopping by, Craig. Appreciate it.
You bet. Anytime.
Speaking of the Big Ten, USC is in that conference because nothing makes sense in this particular world. And we got to talk about the Trojans because it's Transfer Tuesday and they're bringing in guys that you need to know about. First, today's episode of Locked On College Football is brought to you by our friends at Nissan. Are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little further? Ever wonder what adventure could be around the next corner? Our friends at Nissan have a lineup of SUVs with the capabilities to take your adventure to the next level. Look at the 2024 Nissan Rogue, for instance. It's perfect for city drives and great escapes. Class exclusive Google built-in is your always updating assistant to call on for almost anything. Gone are the days of connecting your phone. Google Assistant, Google Maps, and the Google Play Store are built right into the 12.3-inch HD touchscreen infotainment system. The 2024 Rogue is the perfect midsize crossover for your next adventure, or maybe you want to roll with the Pathfinder. Has room for up to 8, an expansive cargo capacity, and an advanced 4x4 capability. Whatever you are looking for, Nissan has got you covered. Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Shop nissanusa.com. That's nissanusa.com. When I say USC football, what's the first thing you think of? Bad defense, right? I know. You don't think about the explosive offense or Caleb Williams or Lincoln Riley. You just think bad defense that didn't allow them to hit their full potential this past year. They went 8-5, 7-5 going into their bowl game. So what would you think USC needed to do this offseason? Improve their defense, right? Where did that start? Hiring a new defense coordinator. Oh, they did that. Made a great hire. D'Anton Lynn from UCLA. Go look at the numbers that his defense put up last year. Yeah, they were very good. But then you would think, well, it's not just about a coach. I mean, you can only make a great dish if you've got good ingredients. I'm here to tell you that USC is utilizing the transfer portal to make themselves a better defense. I never have qualms about what Lincoln Riley's going to do offensively. I have questions, as everybody else does, about what they're going to do on the defensive side of the ball. And I'm here to tell you that they have improved tremendously. Not just because they have a defensive coordinator that will have that side of the ball better organized, better schemed, and get better play calls in than Alex Grinch did last year. It was a mess. It was a mess. But on this Transfer Tuesday, I want to talk about the players that D'Anton Lynn is going to have at his disposal, because there are several notable guys on that side of the ball. Several guys that weren't there last year that are going to come in, they're going to start. I expect them to start right away, and they're going to make an impact, and they're going to be good players. And this is a defense that lost some guys from last year's roster. You know what I say? Good. Clearly it wasn't working out very well. They have added 4 guys in particular that you should be aware of, because USC's schedule is really hard. It's really, really hard. And I love them over 7.5 wins. That's their win total on FanDuel. Get that before it goes to 8.5. I know their schedule is brutal, but these guys are going to make an impact. Let's start with John Humphrey, who's going to come in at corner. Look, they had a former 5-star in Damani Jackson last year. It wasn't going particularly well. He goes down to Alabama. Should be able to reach his full potential or something close to it because he's going to have much better coaching. But you bring in a guy in John Humphrey who was in that UCLA secondary last year. And in every area that you look at that UCLA defense last year, they were nasty. They were nasty. They were well coached. They were well schemed. They played hard. They were very, very good. It was the UCLA offense that actually held the Bruins back last year and led them to have the same regular season record as USC at 7-5, which is below where each was capable of reaching. But John Humphrey's a guy who, according to Pro Football Focus, had a grade last year of just under 80 on over 600 snaps. He's not the only former Bruin defensive back that's coming into the secondary for the Trojans this year. They're bringing in Kamari Ramsey. Kamari Ramsey, someone who 24/7 Sports thinks is a 4-star transfer in the portal, and USC's picked him up. Yeah, he had almost 600 snaps last year in a PFF grade, right around 79. He's not the only defensive back. Those two guys are going to be on the field. I expect Achille Arnold to be there as well. If you ask Oregon State fans about their safety room from 2023, well, Keaton Oladapo, I mean, that guy is just a bona fide stud. But Achille Arnold is not someone who you just discard, who you look at and say, maybe one day he could be good. No, he also played over 650 snaps last year. PFF thinks, yeah, good player right there. So you got three guys in the secondary for a pass defense that was atrocious, a group of people who also could not tackle a high school team, it seemed at times last year. You bring in three guys that have played at a high level in their previous stop and are coming to USC, and it's going to be a plug-and-play situation. These are not flyers. These are not guys who you look at and say, well, like Damani Jackson at Alabama, for instance. You're not looking at him and saying, well, he's got elite physical traits. He just hasn't put it all together yet. Maybe now could be the time. No, these guys are proven. These guys are proven all-conference caliber players, plus starters on your defense, and they're going to be there. And guess what? They're not the only ones. They're not the only ones at all. And by the way, it's not as if USC is some slouch in recruiting under Lincoln Riley. Have they reached their full potential in that regard? Not even close to it. Their high school class in the 2024 cycle is 20th in the country. It should be higher than that. But it's not as if that's bad. It's not as if there's no talent on the roster. It's not as if they're trying to start completely from scratch. No, they're just trying to add a few high-end pieces here and there to at least stabilize. And remember this. USC does not need to build the best defense in the Big Ten. They don't need to have the second or third or fourth best defense in the Big Ten. In an 18-team conference, if they can be, seventh, USC is not only going over 7.5 wins, they'll contend for a conference championship. Because with Miller Moss at quarterback, that offense is going to be plug and play successful once again. We saw it in the bowl game against Louisville. And I have no reason to think that that was just a fluke or a one-off, because Miller Moss has been there for a couple of seasons. He knows Lincoln Riley's system. Lincoln Riley knows him, and he's clearly got the faith and confidence in that particular player. So I think that USC's offense is going to be just fine. And I think their defense has added these players that is going to make them significantly better. Now, they're starting from a very low point. Is it all going to get fixed in 1 year? Are they going to have a top 3 defense? No, I don't think so. But gosh, if they're just in the top third of the conference defensively in some key metrics like yards allowed and points allowed or rushing defense and stuff like that, they could be all right. They could be all right. And you know what helps to have a better run defense? They had a talented player in Tackett Curtis leave via the transfer portal. They've got some roster turnover, but they brought in a guy from Oregon State, the relative, I believe they are cousins. I could be wrong on that front. Easton Mascarenas Arnold is related to Achille Arnold. They were both on Oregon State's defense last year. They were key players for the Beavs a season ago, who were dealing with some losses themselves via the transfer portal and senior year departures, and were still a better defense than what USC put on the field. Well, now 2 of their key players are going to come play for a high-level defensive coordinator, and Easton Mascarenas Arnold also played a lot of football last year, 106 tackles. So I've got a tackling machine at linebacker. I've got 3 high-end starters on the back end of that defense via the transfer portal. And that's not even factoring in what D'Anton Lynn could do with the players that were already there. They also brought in a Power 5 transfer, DeCarlos Nicholson, who played around 500 snaps last year for Mississippi State. So they're bringing in guys who they don't need to work on, who don't need time to adjust to the Power 4 level or anything of the sorts. They're bringing in guys who have got a track record of success, and they just need the proper coaching, the proper scheme, the proper development. I think they've got the guy to do that. But these transfers make a big impact. And look, we saw with Colorado last year, you cannot build an entire team via the transfer portal. But can you reshape yourself on one side of the ball? Can you make drastic improvements by making the right coach or coordinator hire and a couple of key pieces? We have seen that that is the case. And that is what USC has done right here. Get USC over 7.5 while you can. It's not going to last. I think before the season starts, USC's win total will bump up to 8.5. That's how I feel. Last team that I felt you should get in on was Colorado at 4.5. It went up to 5.5. So the power of Locked On College Football, it just cannot be underestimated, of course. And USC's schedule, make no mistake about it, is brutal. It's absolutely brutal. Their first 5 games are LSU, neutral site in Las Vegas, Utah State at home, at Michigan, hosts Wisconsin, at Minnesota. That's a brutal 5-game stretch. They could go 3-2 and play some pretty good football. I think it's more likely they go 4-1. But regardless, after that, you have got a very manageable stretch of games. You play Penn State after Minnesota, but it's at home. Then it's Maryland, Rutgers, Washington, Nebraska, UCLA. Last year, USC started 6-0 and went 1-5 down the stretch. You could see something close to the opposite of that this year because of the defensive improvement. They could struggle out of the gate. They could have 3 losses in their first 5 or 6 games, but down the stretch, they're not losing more than 1 game. They have Notre Dame to end the year. That's their toughest game on the back half of their schedule quite easily. And oh, by the way, that's being played at home. Appreciate everyone listening. I will see you next time. And until then, hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.